Hello, Dr. Jones, and welcome to virtual or eHampton School, as some of us are calling it. I'm Esther Arnott, and this is my colleague Sarah Wilcox, and we are absolutely thrilled to be able to talk to you today, and to hear more from your work after Hitler, the last days of the Second World War in Europe. And if we may, if Sarah can start with our first question.
Dr. Jones, from the news footage and photos of VE Day in 1945, it appears as a significant celebration. There seemed to be a sense of elation or sense of relief and maybe freedom. But was that the whole picture in Britain? What else was going on in Britain with regards to the war that the news of the day perhaps doesn't show?
Yeah, it definitely was part of the picture. When I was writing the book, I took my boys down to talk to my mum, and my mum went up into Buckingham Palace on the 8th of May. She was 18 with her best friend, and she said it was absolutely incredible. They saw Churchill, and indeed on the train, as I was chatting to the boys, an old lady came down the carriage and said, "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation, and I still remember vividly as a child being at a street party to celebrate the end of the war." So it was a big deal. And I think it was, I'm going to answer both segments of your question. I think it's interesting to compare it with the end of World War I in November 1918. And one difference is that World War II was total war. So the air power, that there were a few Zeppelin attacks in World War I, but in World War II there was mass bombing. Civilians became a target. So the population of Britain was celebrating the end of total war, the end of mass bombing, the end of the Blitz, and then in 1944 to 45, the end of the rocket attacks, the V1 and the V2 attacks. And Croydon, where I live, was particularly badly hit by those rockets. So yes, absolutely, there was a lot of elation, but also the difference from World War I was that the whole war wasn't over. So we were still fighting the Japanese, and fighting was going on in the Far East while the celebrations were happening in the West. There was fighting in Burma. And at this stage, I mean, with hindsight, we know that the use of atomic weapons shortened the war. But ordinary people, and indeed British soldiers in the Far East, did not know that in May 1945. So my mum, 18-year-old, she hadn't met my dad yet. She was celebrating in London. My dad was fighting the Japanese in Burma and was aware that they did not surrender. And for those soldiers and for their families, I've seen the letters between my dad and his parents, and they clearly were worried that he wouldn't get back. Mm-hmm. So it was impossible to completely celebrate. Obviously, the newsreels wanted to capture the celebration when the fighting was still going on against an opponent who didn't accept the Geneva Convention and was prepared, it seemed, to fight to the very end.
Thank you. And what about Europe? What was taking place around Europe on these days of the sort of early May 1945? Can you give us a flavour of the events and situations there?
Yeah, well, of course.
Yeah.
But yes, so the first thing to say is that we have two VE days, so that Russia and the socialist Soviet republics that have now become independent, so the whole of the Soviet Union, with the strange exception of Ukraine, that the majority still celebrate the 9th of May as VE Day, and so does Serbia. And what that symbolizes is that in the East, the fighting went on, and there was a pitched battle in Czechoslovakia. There was an uprising in Prague. And if you visit beautiful Prague and go to the old town center, there is about a third of the old town hall left, and the rest of it was being blown up on the 8th of May. You know, Czech patriots were fighting for their lives in an uprising to free their city. The fighting in Czechoslovakia, the Germans refused to surrender to the Red Army, the Russians. There was fighting up to the 11th to 12th of May. And in Slovenia, there was a pitched battle on the 13th. So in the east, the fighting was still going on for probably another week in some places. So the West was celebrating and the East was still fighting our Eastern allies, the Soviet Union.
Thank you. It particularly strikes me that the VE's Day celebrations, as Sarah mentioned at the start, sort of that we saw and that we see in the news and that we see the photos of, which feels so evocative. It feels particularly poignant to think of what you've just expressed here about the variety of experiences across the globe, so that VE Day actually doesn't have a sense of a international celebration, and that's particularly poignant, I think, for us as we remember next week that it wasn't all celebration. There was still so much to sort and so much heartache still everywhere. Talking of sort of things to, you know, heartache and personal stories and experiences, in your research, have you come across stories of individuals that have sort of stayed with you? You mentioned your parents' story, but I wonder if there are other stories that have particularly stayed with you.
Yes, I've written a number of books on World War II, and I've had the privilege of working with some very remarkable veterans, civilian and military. And their stories have never left me. I've worked with veterans of Stalingrad, survivors of the siege of Leningrad, perhaps the worst siege and the worst battle in human history. And meeting those people and getting to know them, their stories certainly do not ever go. And it's been, you know, it's grim testimony, but it's also been a privilege. And the same's true with after Hitler and the ending of the war. And I was reflecting on this question, and there were many acts of kindness that showed, if you like, the good side of the human spirit amidst all this horror. And one segment of the story that has a lot of resonance right now is the medical teams, and I'm talking about British, American, and also Russian, who stayed in the concentration camps. So on the 8th of May, you know, they were working Royal Ambulance men, medics, chaplains in Bergen-Belsen, which was an experience out of hell, at considerable risk to themselves, and risk because there was infectious disease around, enormous psychological risk. So these very brave people, men and women, volunteered to stay. So it was after the liberation of the camps, and worked to try and get these poor people back to health. And some did not survive. So that was deeply moving, and interviewing Russians, Americans, and Britons who did this remarkable thing. And of course, it reminds us right now of the bravery of our remarkable National Health Service and the bravery of frontline healthcare workers all around the world. So perhaps amidst the horror, there are also the extraordinary things about human nature and human beings that also surface at these times of great crisis and great risk.
Thank you. That's incredibly poignant, and something I hadn't ever stopped to think about, in fact, in terms of those medical professionals having to stay on for longer. It is very much something that I think can be easily forgotten. So thank you. Dr. Jones, it has been incredible to talk to you, even for such a short window of time. And thank you very, very much. And we yeah, we would love to promote your book. So just hold it up for once more, if you could. So After Hitler, it's a wonderful book and I thoroughly recommend it. Thank you very much.